You had mentioned the disillusionment that kicks in again in the, particularly in places like the New York Times. You can even track this in the columns of Nicholas Kristof, one of my favorite negative examples of how to write about Russia, when he literally wrote that Putin had let him, Kristof, down because he, Putin, had not turned out to be a sober Yeltsin. Well, what he meant by Yeltsin was Yeltsin, outwardly at least, went along with this charade that Bill Clinton enacted in the 90s of this great Russian-American post-Soviet friendship. It wasn't true. It was for public consumption. And Kristof wanted Putin to be like Yeltsin in that regard. That is, to be completely deferential to American interest, or what Kristof thought were American interest. And when Putin turned out to be different from Yeltsin, Kristof felt personally betrayed. So there's an example of what we're expecting Russian leaders to be, and yet they're coming out of a completely different history.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. I want to bring us back to this point about NATO. You recognize this man as George Kennan.
Oh, that's Kennan.
Yes,
Yeah.
George Kennan. So,
hold on a second.
Yes.
So I lived and taught in Princeton when George lived in Princeton, and I knew him very well, but I've never seen this photograph. And the reason is, of course, George was much older when I knew him. He's quite a young man there. He looks like he might be in his 40s.
That might have been when he was stationed in Moscow.
It might have been, yeah. But I knew him when he was already this kind of, wizened, gray elder statesman who had this up and down career with Washington.
I've mentioned his long telegram often. Of course, it's one of the sort of foundational pieces of American foreign policy that anyone reads who's interested in international relations. He gave an interview in 1998. I don't know if you remember this, to Thomas Friedman. And it was
I do remember.
It was in the New York Times. It was titled Foreign Affairs, Now a Word from X. And of course, X was because
George
it was signed X when it was published in Foreign Affairs. His
anonymously.
Letter, anonymously. And I want to read some passages from this article because I find it to be incredibly prescient, to the point that it's disturbingly prescient.
On Kennan's part, not on Friedman's part.
On Kennan's part. Yeah, no, not on Friedman's part. I'm going to just take pieces of it because they really make this point. He said, I think when referring to the expansion of NATO, he says,
this is George Kennan speaking.
This is George Kennan speaking.
Speaking to Friedman.
He said, yes. He said, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you it is how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. And he ended the conversation, according to Friedman, saying, this has been my life, and it pains me to see it so screwed up in the end.